Would you ask Professor Johnson to come back in, please? All right, Professor Johnson.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you. When you're ready, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Professor Johnson, welcome back. I'd like now to turn to a different topic, if I may, namely how fire and rescue services can prepare for and mitigate communications problems in high-rise buildings. And I'd like to start that topic with radio repeaters and leaky feeders. We've already looked at that technology in the context of enhancing propagation of signals. If we go next to paragraph 7.1.1 on page 173 of your report, we'll pick up what you say about GRA 3.2 there. Do you quote from it? Where there are communications difficulties, specialist equipment such as leaky feeder, radio cable, airwave radios or repeater equipment can be used, and the incident commander should also consider the use of internal or mobile telephones, public address systems or loudhailers to communicate with building occupants. And the citation from footnote 349, which you don't have on your screen, is GRA 3.2, page 33. Now, you go on, I think, to identify in the paragraphs of your report which follow that there are limitations to how effective leaky feeders can be. We've already covered quite a few of them this morning, so I think I can take them quickly. First, am I right? One of the limitations is they're typically effective only within line of sight.
Yes.
Second, the need to amplify their signal propagation, resulting in the need to lay a number of repeaters.
Yes.
Every 200 metres, I think.
Yes.
If you look at policy 700. Thirdly, the possibility that they'll be a victim of their own success by, as you told us earlier, increasing congestion because more people want to use it.
That's correct.
Now, to what extent do those limitations that we've just enumerated apply to fixed leaky feeders or radio repeaters?
Most of the arguments will continue to remain for fixed leaky feeders. However, obviously some of the inconvenience with the installation will not be so apparent because the cables, etc., can be appropriately sited. I think there are several other issues, though, within that context that I've mentioned before, that the mobile repeaters are likely to be more resilient to damage to the building because they can be deployed with any damage ongoing taken into account. So again, there are benefits and also concerns.
Now, if we go to page 189 of your report, please, section 7.9.1, you quote here at length from the evidence of former Commissioner Ron Dobson to the Lacknell House inquest.
Yes.
And the transcript there at 189 of your report is something we looked at with Assistant Commissioner Gary Reason when he came to give evidence. But let's just look at it a little bit more closely again. If you go to page 190, in the final line of this page, what he says is, it would not be the incident commander's first choice, we could turn the page, to use leaky feeders in a scenario such as Lacknell, because they would divert attention from other priority tasks to lay the cable out, but more importantly, it would represent a further hazard in the stairwell where they have to lay the cable up, so it would not be the incident commander's preference, but it would be a piece of equipment that would be available to them. I think you agree that he's right about the practical limitations identified there, as we've just discussed.
Very much so.
And if we go on then to your report at page 197, if we can, and look at section 7.13.1, you say there that I think you consider the substantial size and weight of the equipment to be another practical limitation on its use.
Yes.
I'm summarising, but that's your view, is it?
Yes.
Yes. Do you know how heavy this equipment is?
I don't, but I'm taking this directly from the evidence as presented to the inquiry.
Yes. Do you know whether you could lay or use leaky feeders in a stairway full of smoke? Or if not full of smoke, smoke logged?
I think there are several issues around that again, because obviously with a single stairwell you have ingress and egress occurring at the same time as you might be trying to lay the leaky feeders. And so I think it's a significant decision to deploy them. And as suggested in Commissioner Dobson's evidence, it would not necessarily be the first thing that you would think of doing.
That would be aggravated by the fact that a particular stairwell was the sole means of escape.
Very much so.
And would it also be aggravated, in addition, by the fact that there might, at some stage of the incident, be water gushing down it?
Yes.
And might that affect the electrics?
Yes.
Now, you've given consideration at page 189 of your report, if we can go back to that, please, to the findings of the 7-7 committee. And if we look at 784, section 7.8.4, in the middle of that page, you say this: the 7-7 committee argued that the deployment of mobile leaky feeders was an, quote, interim backup stroke solution and, quotes, unlikely to help in the critical first hours of an emergency, close quotes. And that's a quotation from the London Assembly's report of the 7th of July Review Committee at page 22. You go on, I think, to say these warnings do not seem to have informed FRS policy advocating the use of this technology as a primary means of restoring incident ground communication. And you give the example we've cited already from, which was GRA 3.2 itself. Do you agree or do you disagree with the opinion that leaky feeders are unlikely to help in the critical first hours of an emergency?
I agree. I also feel that my concern would have been mitigated if more personnel had had experience of using them and deploying them, and that there were more examples of their successful deployment in operational practice than I could find in the evidence presented to me.
Right. And can you just explain briefly why you agree that in the early hours, the first critical hours of the incident, use of leaky feeders would not be would be unlikely to help?
If I go back to Commissioner Dobson's point that they would not be the first solution, if you like, for an incident commander, I think that what he's alluding to there is that there would have to be significant and sustained communication problems before somebody felt that the effort was worthwhile.
Right.
And also the point that we noted earlier about other operational priorities taking precedent over the deployment of the leaky feeders.
So this is not a technical objection in the sense of functionality of the equipment itself, as opposed to operational considerations about the effort and timing of deployment.
I think those two things are very closely entwined, because the argument for using them has to be made on experience of communication failures. However, I feel that if sufficient pre-inspections had been done, then that might encourage the use of their deployment at an earlier stage. However, that does not also invalidate the argument that other more immediate concerns, such as following up FSG and other priorities, would maybe take importance over the deployment of leaky feeders. And I think, as I said before, it's complicated in the sense of if you only have a small number of people trained to deploy them, for example, the extended duration teams, you may make an operational decision that uses them in other ways than deployment of leaky feeders. So in principle, technically, I agree with you that does not prevent their early deployment. However, the evidence that I've seen from their operational use and all of the arguments I presented there, I think, convince me that it's a significant step, and normally they are only deployed after sustained communication failure.
Now, you go on in the paragraph to say that the warnings don't seem to have informed FRS policy advocating the use of this technology as a primary means of restoring incident ground communications. Are you saying that fire and rescue services such as the LFB ignored the warning from the 7-7 review committee?
I think that the warning that the 7-7 committee issues in their report argues against the overconfidence in the ability to deploy leaky feeders as a way of mitigating communication problems.
Right.
And I would have liked to have seen a more sustained argument in any of the policies advocating their use about why these problems identified by 7-7.
Do you criticise GRA 3.2 itself, which of course was the national guidance?
Well, I think GRA 3.2 it is correct. I was going to use a double negative there. It's correct in the sense that it advocates the use of a range of alternate communication means, but those communication means, as we've discussed, vary enormously in terms of their operational ability to be used. So mobile telephones are useful in certain situations, but probably not very useful in the operational situation where people are using breathing apparatus, etc.
Now, page 34 of your report, if we can go back to that, you'll see that on that page you have section 220.2 with this is within it, and there's a subparagraph 4 at the foot of the screen. Adopt layered fallback arrangements, and then you have a quotation, and after that it says, the LFB's fallback mechanisms failed to provide the intended levels of resilience at the Grenfell Tower fire. In particular, the failure to correctly deploy radio repeaters and leaky feeders eliminated a key fallback arrangement. Why do you describe leaky feeders there as a key fallback arrangement for the LFB?
I think that aligns well with your previous points in that if given all the caveats that we've raised about the problem, the physical problems of deploying them, it's only the case, I think, that they would be used if sustained communication failures were experienced. And as we'll presumably discuss shortly, voice repeaters were not deployed, and therefore that ability to improve the communication infrastructure through the use of this technology was not available to those who had to fight the fire and rescue the occupants of the building.
Now, if we go to page 57 of your report, let's look at section 4.3.9, which runs over 2 pages, to page 58. You set out there the CLG and the CFRA's National Operational Guidance, or NOG, document entitled Breathing Apparatus. And if you go to page 58 at the second paragraph on that page, please, you'll see that it says BA wearers and BA control operatives should be aware of the potential for limited penetration of radio signals into buildings and structures below ground, and either make other arrangements or put contingencies in place to ensure the safety and effectiveness of communications with BA teams. And if you go to page 58 at the bottom, the next paragraph, but one down, paragraph 4.3.11, you say you have seen no evidence that guidance informed policy or resulted in any specific actions. Why is it that you don't consider leaky feeders and radio repeaters to fall into the category of other arrangements or contingencies?
I think there are a number of points I would make. I think that there was from reading the witness statements, I feel that there was great confusion about these contingencies, if we viewed them as a contingency. And my feeling was that I don't think that sufficient arrangements had put in place to ensure that those contingencies were effective. I have a couple of other related, very short points in this, which is that we have to remember that intrinsic safety is used in environments of where flammable or explosive substances may be found, and at the same time, the other area, apart from high-rises, in which leaky feeders are recommended is in the use of tunnels. However, as we discussed this morning, leaky feeders, as we've seen them as they are used now, are not intrinsically safe. So that raises the question about, if it were another scenario rather than a high-rise, but a tunnel incident, how would you maintain communication with leaky feeders which violate the intrinsic safety requirements? And this is another example of that kind of more detailed system-level thinking about what dangers might face future communication that, if you like, to me, also speaks to the point that you've just made, not just about high-rises, but also structures below ground, as is referred to in that quotation.
Now, looking at page 190 of the report, please, if we can skip to that, and look at section 7.9.3, you explain your view And you say, it is unclear what measures the LFB put in place to mitigate the risks associated with or to enhance the efficacy of deploying leaky feeders and radio repeaters in high-rise buildings. What sort of measures might you expect a fire and rescue service to consider?
I would just, at the very simplest level, how to deal with the trip hazards that could be incurred when trying to install this equipment and how to coordinate it with the other activities through a single stairwell. I mean, that might seem very trivial, but...
That's about installation and deployment, which is entirely physical. But what about the electronic or functional, technical efficacy?
I think, as we discussed this morning, with the line of sight characteristics of leaky feeders and the construction of high-rise buildings, as you asked me this morning about the topology and how far would the signal reach out of the stairwells, I mean, again, I found no evidence base on which to place faith that leaky feeders would restore the communications problems in the majority of high-rise buildings that might be found in London.
No, absolutely. But what I'm really trying to get at is whether you can tell us what sort of mitigation measures you would expect a fire and rescue service as of June 2017 to have considered, where the LFB did not.
Well, I would have considered. I have not found any detailed evidence about how to mitigate things like the drip hazards and how to coordinate them with the other uses of a stairwell. Just very simple functional requirements about how to reduce the risks to residents being evacuated and firefighters ingressing into the building.
Right, but the risk associated with the efficacy of deploying leaky feeders and radio repeaters in high-rise buildings isn't limited to trip hazards. It's also, I think, as you explained earlier, to do with the technical efficacy, such as the inability to penetrate concrete or steel.
Absolutely.
And what sort of mitigation measures would you have expected LFB reasonably to have put in place to have overcome those problems?
Well, it's possible to have additional repeaters that branch at different floors, and so there are technical measures that could have been put in place to create more elaborate structures if needed within high-rise buildings. But again, the installation of more cables and more repeaters diverts staff for longer from those other activities and so forth. So it's to me, this policy is put in place, but I would really love to see more evidence about the benefits associated with leaky feeders in terms of their communication versus the costs in terms of operational outcomes through the installation of additional equipment. It would be easy to sit here and say we can address the communication problems by installing more elaborate architectures of communications, but then if that has a significant increased risk to put people in the confined spaces or has a negative effect in terms of the operational resources that we have available. In other words, if we divide everyone to doing this and not enough to answering the FSG calls, etc. I think, again, there is a need to do that more detailed planning and risk assessment to determine what is the best policy in the future going forward with an evidence base, not based on my subjective assessments.
Now, part of your work, Professor, was to demonstrate that the firefighters at Grenfell Tower inadvertently deployed telemetry repeaters rather than radio repeaters, and that is why attempts on the night to use Channel 2 could not have been successful. And I think you offer the view, and this is at paragraph 7.14.4 on page 199, that the confusion between radio repeaters and telemetry repeaters, you say, was indicative of the limited training in and exposure to the use of these communications aids. You can see it there on the screen. And you also say elsewhere, I think, and this is 2 paragraphs earlier on page 193, that only EDBA personnel had actually been trained in the deployment of radio repeaters.
Yes.
First, as a general question, how complex, if at all, is the setup and operation of a leaky feeder and radio repeater?
I think with adequate training, it should not be complex at all.
And would you expect training to be given?
I see that it is being subsequently since the fire. Yes,
right.
But there are again issues in the sense that I can understand at one level why it may have been reserved to the EDBA, whereas in the sense that if additional time in the building is spent laying the cables and putting the repeaters into place, there may be additional risk in terms of the amount of time that takes. So it's not simply the connectivity, it's the physical effort involved in taking the equipment to the level that you want to install it at, and then safely navigating through the building, etc.
Looking a little bit more closely then at training, can we go to page 83 and 84, both together, of your report, at section 4.16, and underneath the rubric training reform following the Lacknell House fire, and you say there, following the Lacknell House fire, the LFB's training, commissioning and alterations form, use of authority issued radio communication equipment, TCAP 0039, was drafted with the aim of creating a training package to cover the effective use of communications equipment at operational incidents, including both high-rise and subsurface incidents. And then you cite from some of the evidence there. If we go then to TCAP, that TCAP form 0039, we see that at LFB 30s41958. That's the first page. If we go to page 11 in it, we can see from the bullet point list that computer-based training, if you look at the bullet points, computer-based training, CBT, was due to be provided on, amongst other things, operation of the radios, Airwave and UHF, as well as the radio repeater equipment, wasn't it?
Yes.
Certainly to station-based
Yes.
operational stuff. Yes. Now let's look at the packages which were developed, which I think which were not released. Can we go to LFB 001222846? This is a copy, when it comes up, there it is. This is a copy of the station-based radio equipment training package uploaded on the 14th of March 2014, and it will be familiar to those who were following Assistant Commissioner Gary Reason's evidence on day 182 when I put it to him. And if we go to page 2 of this document, we can see that there are 4 objectives of this session, and I'll just show them to you. List the range of radio equipment used operationally within the London Fire Brigade. 2, describe the function of the radio equipment. 3, select radio equipment as appropriate for use in operational scenarios. 4, demonstrate the assembly and use of Barry radio equipment. And the package goes on to describe key items of communications equipment. So we can go to page 14. You can see that there's an explanation of the Barry set. And at page 20, there's a description of a radio repeater's capability, page 20 there. And at page 21, we can see there is an explanation of what is available in the brigade about repeaters. 17 UHF repeaters are available, 1 on each CU. But that is the totality of the guidance on repeaters. For completeness, can I show you LFB 001222844, which is the senior officer package released the previous week, the 6th of March 2014. And if we go to page 3 in that, we can see the objectives of the package. 4 bullet points. Describe the functions and use of the analog handheld radio, radio repeater and digital mainstream radio. Describe situations where interagency voice communications and procedures can be used and how it would be implemented. Identify and find solutions for radio communication issues. Apply your knowledge of how radio equipment can be used to an exercise scenario. And if we jump ahead to page 23, this has a title, Large and Complex Buildings or Underground Structures May Adversely Affect Radio Communications. That's the text under the heading Communication Issues and Solutions. And it's a rollover for the images, so it's interactive. But that is the totality of the guidance on the role that buildings such as high-rise buildings can have on communications. The slides themselves start on page 17. And there you can see the functionality of the radio repeaters and leaky feeders and how to set them up. But again, that's the totality of the guidance on repeaters. I've shown you both these programs now. Do you have any particular views about whether those training packages, had they been rolled out, would have adequately trained individuals to whom they were aimed in the setup and operation of this kind of equipment?
On their own, they would not have prepared people to be able to deploy the equipment. They would simply have alerted them to the presence of the equipment. And I noticed that there's no distinction made clearly in the slides between a radio repeater and a telemetry repeater.
You say not on their own. What else would you need in order, if you were rolling this out, to have trained individuals sufficiently well in the setup and operation of this kind of equipment?
I think practical experience would have been essential.
When you say practical experience in the field or simulated in physical training?
I think it's clear to me that a mixture would be required. So practicing skills in a simulated environment and then gradually introducing other operational complexities, such as as we both or all of us discussed, the issue to the point at which somebody would be confident to deploy them is an absolutely crucial question, and how that interferes with other operational business. And that's why I say both sorts of training. If you train with the equipment in a controlled environment, in an office or in a hall or outside in a training ground, that's different from the operational consequences of making the decision in a single stairwell with other hazards available.
Now, can we go back to page 24 of your report and look at section 2.9? This is within that section on page 24, subparagraph 14. You say extended duration breathing apparatus, EDBA crews were trained to install leaky feeders. However, the LFB's operational focus on the night of the fire was on deploying as many of these teams into the tower as possible to facilitate rescues. This may have delayed attempts to deploy repeaters and leaky feeders. Do you have any views about the optimal time window in which this equipment should be deployed?
I think there's an awful lot of ambiguity as it presently arises in the policies in terms of when would be appropriate to deploy them. I think that when a certain number of units are called, I don't know, make 5, make 10, whatever you would prefer, to whatever could be justified in terms of risk assessment, that an assumption might be made that there are so many people attending to that incident that communication is a top-level priority. And so by default, at a particular level, you might decide that that's the time to install it, or you would have a communications officer deployed who in turn assumed explicit responsibility through a checklist, and at that point they would be responsible. So in other words, there would be a predetermined point at which it was decided to install it or not install it, and that would be in a consistent way, rather than leaving it totally at the discretion of a commander based on what's...
So you say, do you, that the timing of the deployment of leaky feeders and radio repeaters, if you're going to use them, is a function of the number of officers on the incident ground?
I would suggest that I think what worries me the most is that for the reasons presented by Commissioner Dobson, that this would not be an attractive choice, that there should be at some point a documented decision that they've at least been considered, and that should in some way be related to the level of risk posed to both the firefighters and the occupants of the building, however that may be determined.
Yes. I
chose that, the number of appliances as a proxy for that risk assessment, because it's simpler, but I think it would be that kind of decision would require operational input. But I think the key thing is to have consistency and to have a clear point at which, or threshold at which, the decision is taken to deploy them or not deploy them. This is the kind of world I'm familiar with in terms of aviation or the nuclear industry and so on, where there are checklists to be followed, and those checklists can be triggered by different things. But at that point, if the checklist is triggered, you should follow a consistent set of procedures, and it's not purely left up to the decision of a pilot as to improvise, if you like, what things are or are not done at that point.
Yes, just to go back to the point about telemetry repeaters as opposed to radio repeaters, we looked at earlier where you said that the two got confused on the night, inadvertently, by firefighters.
Yeah.
We also saw that TCAP 0039 did not distinguish between radio repeaters and telemetry repeaters.
Yes.
Are you able to, do you have a view about whether there was something more than an incident-related confusion between the two? In other words, is it your view that the confusion between telemetry repeaters and radio repeaters might be more institutional?
Yes, I think there's ample evidence from the witnesses to this inquiry that people were often not familiar with the distinction, and I think I think it's important. There's a much more general point here about training in the FRS, which is that in my job, somebody continually assesses the effectiveness of my education. So my educational provision isn't determined by my own exams or the students taking those exams. There are independent agencies every year that come in and assess whether or not my university education meets national and international standards. And very much the impression I get from the training and the witnesses that have been to this inquiry is that the quality of the training is often dependent on the experience of individual fire officers, and also the external providers, from the evidence I've seen, are not exposed to the level of scrutiny that I would be, even in a non-safety critical environment.
So in the context of what you've seen and studied for the purposes of this inquiry, you see is this right? You see inconsistency as a result of lack of standardization imposed from outside?
Lack of independent monitoring of training and outcome-based assessment of training. So I think, although we could focus on telemetry repeaters and voice repeaters, I think there are longer or other deeper questions about the effectiveness of training. So my feeling about the question that you asked in terms of TCAP and also in terms of the drills and exercises is that, and as I understand it, typical training for a fire officer goes through a cycle, and that they may only be exposed to a particular piece of pedagogy for a short time, and then if it's not used operationally for a long period of time, they may then have lost that knowledge that they at one time had. And I would like more confidence as a member of the public that that's assessed, and the degradation of knowledge over time when it's not being practiced is in some way assessed, because simply saying that somebody's been through one of these procedures or one of these exercises doesn't mean that they're capable of repeating that throughout their lifetime and their period of operation.
Right. Indeed. Okay. Can I then turn to a different topic, which is section 72D, and what I would call 72D visits,
Yes.
with the caveat that the word visit does not appear in the section.
Apologies.
It's about arrangements for obtaining information for the statutory purpose contained in section 7.1. But now we look at that in your report at page 96 at section 5. That's where it starts. Although it is of course in the context of opportunities for guidance, training and site visits to mitigate technical and operational constraints on barrier sets and other radio communication equipment in Grenfell Tower. So the context of this is mitigation, but using what you call site visits.
Yes.
Now, can we go to page 102, please? Section 5.3.4 on page 102. And you say there, by reference to LFB's policy number 800, which is on the management of operational risk information, you say in 5.3.4, it is remarkable how little of PN 800 is devoted to potential communications concerns given their importance during the Lacknell House fire. Now, policy 800 is the LFB policy entitled Management of Operational Risk Information, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes, and you set out various excerpts from that policy within this section of your report. In what ways do you consider, in general, that guidance was deficient so far as concerns communications?
As I mentioned this morning, I felt that the coroner outlined the communication difficulties that can arise with barrier sets and with other forms of communication in high-rise buildings. And I felt that combined with other national policy in this area, and GR 3.2 is a good example, created a situation where greater attention should have been paid to the potential for communication problems in high-rise buildings. And I felt that the the practices that are described in the witness statements to this inquiry illustrate great inconsistency in terms of the level of care that was taken in considering issues of communication. I should also have said, which is the context of all of my evidence, that I believe communication is essential, as is made clear in national policy, and not something that should willingly at any time be sacrificed in an incident or any similar incident in the future.
Now, if you look at the foot of page 102 and look at footnote 188, this is the most convenient place to find it, but Policy 800 was reviewed as current at 25th of August 2015. That's some 2.5 years after the coroner's recommendations on the 28th of March 2013. Just given the time lag, have you a view about whether or not sufficient attention was given by the LFB to the communications difficulties identified in the coroner's Rule 43 reports?
I don't think so. I feel that the opportunities to learn lessons from that incident were not taken up as enthusiastically as I would have, I hope, taken them up in that situation. I feel that the coroner's comments on channels were dealt with, but I felt that the Commissioner Dobson's comments, especially about leaky feeders and about the potential hazards and limitations from using them in a high-rise building, were, in my view, not sufficiently reflected in the 7.2D assessments. And also, I would reflect on the conversation that we had before lunch about the post-site inspections and all the caveats that the LFB's own assessment teams made about the reliability of those inspections. And that again echoes the words of Commissioner Dobson in the evidence to the coroner, where he made exactly the same point about the reliability of any on-site inspections which involved to assess radio communications equipment. So I think that there's a huge inconsistency, or there's a huge difficulty in arguing that the lessons of that previous incident were learnt and then reflected in the 7.2D visits.
In the 7.2D visits, but in
the forms.
In a Policy 800.
Yes.
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 Sorry.
Sorry.
I'm correcting you for.
No, you're being really careful, and that's exactly right. Sorry.
Well, and let me be clear as to why. I mean, I tried to hint at it before, but
Right.
Often one hears of 7.2D in the context of inspections or visits, which would tend to indicate that it was a visual exercise.
Yeah.
Do you have a? Let me ask it this way, if I can. Do you have a view about whether it is as narrow as that?
I don't feel competent to comment on that because I've only seen the evidence coming through from the inquiry. So
very well. Let's look at the policy then. Well, let's look at your report at page 105. At section 5.3.11. 11, you say GRA 3.2 in turn inform the LFB's local policy for fighting high-rise fires, known as policy number 633, high-rise firefighting. Appendix 1 of policy number 633, entitled 7.2D, acts as a guide when conducting visits in buildings over 18 metres in height or with 6 or more floors. Now, let's look at 7.2D. In that context, you go on, I think, later in this section of your report to say that the evidence in Phase 1 demonstrates that not all Section 2D visits were carried out in accordance with the guidance.
yes.
And that communications testing wasn't a routine part of a 7.2D visit, even a visit. Is that a fair summary of your observations?
Yes.
And if we go then, with that under our wing then, to page 110 of your report, let's look at section 5.4.4 and 5. You say there, the top of the screen, it's important to note that Watch Officer Rickett's inspection focused on the quality of the communications using his personal radio and not the lower-powered IS devices integrated within the Barry sets. Furthermore, Watch Officer Ricketts only used his radio to communicate from the basement to the ground floor, stroke base of the tower. This is unlikely to have provided a proper understanding of the potential communications concerns for signal propagation between higher and lower floors. Taking the first of those, he tested his personal radio and not the lower-powered Barry-set radio. Why did you consider that to be of significance?
Again, for all the reasons that we've rehearsed this morning between intrinsically safe and non-intrinsically safe devices.
And secondly, as you see, he tested communications as between the basement and the ground floor, or the base of the tower. Why did you consider that to be a limitation on his testing?
Again, if I refer back to Commissioner Dobson's evidence to the previous inquiry, he made it very clear that the specific location, even within a floor, can provide unreliable evidence as to communication across the remainder of that floor. And then obviously, as we described this morning, the higher you go into a building, the more likely you are to get attenuation through the materials and other factors, leaving aside everything else that we've said about meteorology and fire and the congestion issues, etc.
Now, if we go to page 112 of your report at section 5.7.3, you say the lack of systematic procedures within PN 800 for testing communications concerns and blind spots during 72D visits makes them open to the issues that were raised by Ron Dobson, former Commissioner of the LFB, in statements to the National Coroner cited in section 4.17.6 of my report. And then you set out some of the transcript there. Could you explain briefly what you mean by a lack of systematic procedures?
As I again said this morning, I think there is a really significant learning opportunity here to identify certain types of structure for which the risk is sufficiently high to do a more detailed communications inspection. It lies outside the scope of my report, but one of the outcomes of that might be to argue in favour of a permanent form of repeater system or other form of infrastructure mitigation, as is the case with certain types of underground station. And this idea of a systematic procedure is that we have some agreed set of criteria for a building being likely to render significant communication problems in the event of a fire or similar incident taking place. And that could be for reasons of construction, it could be for reasons to do with the scale of the building or the volume of the building or the sensitivity of its content. But again, I come back to the evidence I presented this morning about the static installed repeater systems within the World Trade Center and the benefits that they provided in one tower but not in the other, even though the system functions. So it's not a panacea, but I do feel greater consistency, especially in those buildings that are seen to pose greatest risk to the public or to firefighters, would justify more detailed consideration, and then if another threshold was reached, then an argument about whether a permanent installation is necessary.
Now, we don't need to turn it up, but at section 5.7.8 on page 114 of your report, you, I think, recommend the adoption of validated test procedures for use during visits conducted pursuant to section 7.2D. When you say validated test procedures, can you explain what you mean? I've tried to lay out where my areas of expertise lie. I'm not an expert in the lower level physical properties of radio signals, and so a properly validated study would be by somebody with an appropriate level of qualification in those more physical aspects rather than the safety related aspects that I'm more familiar with, and then also supplemented by empirical evidence, so not purely a theoretical analysis of building structure, but taking the relevant equipment into a range of buildings around London to see whether they were actually realised. Obviously, that won't be the same as in a fire for all the things that we've described, or another incident, but it would give me greater confidence that the conclusions of a pre-site visit were likely to prepare those people on the way to a visit for communications problems. And then, as you alluded to earlier, a building that had gone through that form of assessment, which didn't already have a pre-installed communication system, might be a strong case for the early deployment of a repeater as an operational priority, rather than what we saw in the case of the Grenfell Tower incident. So does it come to this, that you're advocating a standardised and validated form of test for at least all high-rise buildings, high-rise residential buildings, where, or for the purposes of gathering information under Section 72D?
Yes, and I'm very open to more detailed discussions with qualified people about other risk mitigations that might be there. So, for example, if there were two easily traversed stairwells, an argument might therefore be made that it would be easier to deploy repeaters and leaky feeders in that situation where you have another one for ingress and egress. But that is the level of detail that I would like to see considered in buildings of sufficiently high risk. And at the end of this is to increase the confidence both of firefighters and of the residents.
Yeah. Let me put it a slightly different way. Would I be right in thinking that, in your view, it's not enough to leave it to individual fire and rescue services to adopt their own policies and training?
Absolutely.
It needs to be a nationalised, standardised test applied by all fire and rescue services in the discharge of Section 72D.
Absolutely right. I strongly feel that does not compromise the local identity of fire and rescue services with their local knowledge, which I think is important, but equally will give me and the public confidence when I enter a high-rise building in Glasgow or Belfast that I have the same level of protection that I do in London.
Yeah. Can I then turn to Airwave radio again? We looked at a lot of it earlier, and we discussed enhanced transmitting power and signal benefits. I don't think there's a need to turn it up, but at section 8.9.1 at page 218 of your report, you observe, I think, that on the night of the Grenfell Tower fire, Airwave appeared to provide better coverage than the UHF handheld radios. And you also say that they were in short supply and a more flexible approach to communications might have anticipated such a requirement. When you say a more flexible approach to communications, what do you mean?
If we take a step back, the Airwave radios were intended in the FRS to be used tactically and rather than operationally. And the reason for that was a perception that, well, the Home Office requires that there's a responsible person who, if you like, accounts for every Airwave device. And the feeling was that if they were given out on an operational basis, some of the devices would be potentially lost and enable others, unauthorized users, to eavesdrop on that communication mechanism. And while I understand the reasons for that argument at the time at which it was made, I don't think that's sustainable anymore technically, in the sense that it's relatively easy with more modern devices to be able to block a device that's lost from access to the network. And also a more flexible use might have been to have a pool of additional Airwave devices to supplement operational uses in large-scale incidents. That, to me, under exceptional circumstances, might have enhanced communication on the fire ground.
Yes. Now, can we go then to page 222 of your report and look at section 8.12.3? The text of your report there says, Airwave could have provided direct communication between the control room, the command units, and the Bridgehead rather than using the chain of communications, including runners that were deployed on the night. Now, as a background to that, I think we know that handheld Airwave radios were restricted to senior officers, namely those of rank of station manager and above, weren't they?
Yeah.
Yes. Now, looking at what you say there in the text, is it your suggestion, or is your suggestion premised on command personnel having an Airwave device, or are you suggesting that a greater number of firefighters should have been issued with an Airwave radio?
I think, as I discussed with you previously about the Cabinet Office advice on resilient communication, where we were discussing layered fallback mechanisms in the context of leaky feeders and repeaters, I think that having the ability to use other forms of devices and communication infrastructure at a fireground in response to urgent need would have created that resilience that the Cabinet Office intends.
Are you suggesting, though, that a greater number of firefighters should have had Airwave radios?
Yes, I might be suggesting that, yes.
Thank you. Now, can we then turn the page to 224, please? Turn 2 pages to 224, section 8.12.6. There you say at the top of the screen, it's remarkable to me that greater care was not taken by the LFB before and during the fire to ensure robust and resilient communications between the command units and the bridgehead of major incidents. When you say greater care there, what are you referring to?
I am, and I continue to be, can I say, surprised that runners are considered acceptable means of communication given the risk that they were put at. That's a euphemism for saying I'm really, really shocked that they were still, that was what they were forced to do on the night of this incident.
Yes.
Having worked in other industries, I couldn't envisage it in any of the other industries I've worked in my life.
And what steps specifically would you expect a fire and rescue service to take as you contemplate here?
Well, the very lowest level of technical sophistication would be field telephones that were available on the night, but obviously they could have been cut by falling debris, etc. If I was doing a post-incident review as an independent safety consultant, the risk that was posed to runners to me stands out as something that I would never like to see again.
Now, at page 53 of your report, we have section 4. Page 53. And the heading to that is the extent to which the technical and operational functionality of Barry sets is affected when used in concrete high-rise buildings, including incidents which predated the Grenfell Tower fire. And this section, I think, focuses, am I right, on the subject of previous large-scale incidents involving communications difficulties in the context of high-rise buildings and other environments where there have been a lot of concrete and metal. Can we go to page 53, page 4.1.6 at the bottom of the page, where it says LFB staff were aware that propagation issues affected the use of UHF radios in high-rise concrete buildings. Concerns were raised by, and you've got a list, the Health and Safety Executive after the Shirley Tower fire, the Coroner's recommendations after the Lacknell House fire, the Local Government Association's 2015 Fire Peer Challenge, and a CLG Incident Ground Communications Study from 2008. That study, which I think appears referred to at footnote 85 on page 53, if we just pick up that foot of that page there, you can see it. There it is. It's a Fire Research Technical Report, 21 of 2008. Can we go to it? It's at CWJ 6092. There's the first page of it. Am I right that it was commissioned by the DCLG as part of its BDAG, or Building Disaster Assessment Group, in the wake of 9/11?
As I understand it.
Yes, and am I right also is that its intention, well, we can see this actually. If we go to page 6, go to section 1.1, we can quote from it on that page. It says, in the first paragraph at line 2, that it was to consider the issues for fire and rescue services in the UK that have been highlighted by the World Trade Center incident of 11th September 2001, or 9/11. Now, you've reproduced, I think, a number of the report's recommendations, but I'd like to focus, if I can, in particular on recommendations 7 and 8, bearing in mind the fact that this was published in 2008, so 9 years before the Grenfell Tower fire. If we go to page 8 of this document and look at paragraph 1.2.3, on at-incident communications, recommendation 7, and I think I can summarise it, was that no decision should be taken at that time, in 2008, on replacing UHF radio with a Tetra solution. Am I right in summarising it that way?
Yeah.
Now, first, looking at Tetra, am I right in thinking that Tetra is the type of network that Airwave radio utilises?
Yes.
And the recommendation goes on 5 lines from the very bottom of that paragraph. It says, even then, the suitability of Tetra PMR is subject to the availability of all required direct mode operation, DMO functionality, and should be confirmed by appropriate trials in the built and open environments. Any decision to replace the current analog UHF technology must be informed by a rigorous cost-benefit analysis. Now, first, could you just explain to us in layman's terms, if you can, what PMR is?
I think that's a reference to the protocols that are used by Tetra. Pulse mode.
Oh, I see. I see.
Yeah.
Could you help us with what it means when it says it's subject to the availability of all required direct mode operation functionality?
So, as I said this morning, there are 2 different modes within Airwave and Tetra. So there's this trunk mode operation, which is where you communicate through a base station in an analogous way to a mobile phone communicating to a base station. Or there's direct mode operation, which is where you communicate in a way that's analogous to the UHF walkie-talkies. So you're not going through a base station, but you're going hand to hand.
And does the functionality of Tetra use Airwave's talk groups, or is it independent of them?
I believe that Tetra is the foundation on which Airwave is built.
I see. I see. So it's a platform.
Yeah.
I follow.
Yeah.
And now, is this report, this CLG report, saying that the suitability of the broader role of Airwave relies on there being a DMO, direct mode operation, or if you like, walkie-talkie functionality?
Yeah, I think what it's saying is that this possibility exists, but a cost-benefit trade-off has to be considered before replacing the UHF devices because, for example, Airwave devices are more expensive. They have that security consideration, and none of these things apply to the UHF radios.
Yes.
And so, again, there's a wider context to all of this discussion, which is about the value for money for Airwave, which is a current focus for the Competition and Markets Authority's investigation, and also the delay and £3 billion overrun on the emergency services network.
We'll come to that.
Okay, I'll wait for your questions
Yes,
on that.
okay.
But have I explained enough about the context of that, which is that the Fire and Rescue Service use of Airwave for operational reasons was rejected because of the security and the cost as the 2 principal reasons. The provision of direct mode operation, if that had been accepted as an operational requirement, could have been provided in the same way that it would have been available for the police and other agencies.
Right. Now, looking at that last sentence that you focused on, the trade-off with the rigorous cost-benefit analysis, are you aware whether any such analysis was ever conducted either by the DCLG or the LFB or anybody else?
I've not seen that detailed form of cost-benefit analysis, and in particular, I would suggest that I've not seen it in the context of something like Grenfell Tower or Leaky Hall, which I feel would be warranted in that. As I said before, many of these comparisons tend to be done on device characteristics rather than the operational benefits that they might yield to the public and firefighters under those kind of situations.
Now, looking at recommendation 8, that says the existing UHF channel assignments should be examined to see whether it might be possible to modify the channel assignments to further minimise the potential technical limitations of the current channels, and whether the number of available channels could be increased, perhaps by utilising channels vacated by the police service in its transition to the Airwave service. Are you aware whether any such analysis was conducted, again, either by the LFB or more broadly, such as by the department?
I have not seen such an analysis, and as we discussed this morning, with interference identified between the existing channel allocations on possible channel that could have been used, I don't think that it was done, but I feel that would have come to light in evidence based on the questions that have already been asked about the effectiveness of channels, but I have not seen any such document.
Now, if we go to the bottom of page 8 and scroll down, please, to recommendation 12, you'll see there, it says this, that the set of recommendations from this study be used to form a programme of further work, be they new projects or additions to the terms of reference of existing groups. Are you aware of whether any further work was ever conducted in accordance with that recommendation?
I'm unaware of any further work.
Now, if I understand your report correctly, Professor, I think you've observed that the LFB's decision not to broaden its use of airwave radio appears to have been made on the grounds of security concerns as well as the relative cost of airwave radios. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, I should say that when Assistant Commissioner Gary Reason came to give evidence, he told us that he was not aware of cost being a consideration when the LFB were considering the use of airwave radio in response to the Lakanal Coroner's Rule 43 recommendations. And he said that at day 182, page 87, lines 2 to 6. That was his evidence. But in terms of security, are you able to give us a brief overview of the security concerns which might have surrounded the broader use of airwave radio by the LFB?
I'll say two things on that. If you look in my report, at one point there is evidence cited on the cost objection, which refers to the cost of the handsets and also the cost of the additional rental that would be paid on each device. I can't point you to the page immediately, but could certainly find it after this session. And secondly, again in the report, there are sections which deal with concerns over security expressed by those personnel within LFB who are responsible for accounting for the handsets.
I think we can track that down.
Great, thank you.
Helpfully prompted.
Sorry.
No, it's very helpful. If you look at page 211 of your report and look at paragraph 8.4.10, we may find the point you're recalling.
Great. I'm sorry, I got the cost wrong.
Internal emails predating the Grenfell Tower fire reiterated security and financial concerns about the broader use of airwave radio. So you recalled your own report correctly. My question really is, in light of that, and I should just tell you, I mean, this is an email that runs over to page 211.
Yeah.
From an email chain discussing proposals on the management of life-critical information from brigade control to incident ground. I'm not sure we've seen in the factual evidence, but you're relying on that, are you?
Yes.
And this is in the context, I think, of FSG.
Yes.
Yes, I see. But just going back to the security point, can you give us a brief overview of the security concerns surrounding the wider use of airwave?
Airwave is viewed as part of the UK national critical infrastructure, and many years after its intended end date, it's still in operation. From what I don't, for obvious reasons, know the details of how it's secured, but it remains a matter of some amazement to me that these arguments could still be used when one of my areas of expertise is in cybersecurity, and in almost every conceivable situation that I would see today and for many years in the past, it should be possible to deny access to a network for a device that's stolen or lost in the same way it's possible to deny access to a mobile phone which is stolen or lost. However, I can only assume from the eagerness by which people account for these airwave devices that for whatever reason is not possible, presumably is a legacy feature of that infrastructure.
So no encryption possible?
I believe that they are encrypted, but the problem will be that if the device access resides in some way with the hardware on the device and there's no way to account for it, I from a technical point of view, I'm at a loss to understand why this should really be a problem, but it's not the sort of thing that would be advertised to somebody outside of the operational team working with Airwave. So right. I can't answer your question from a technical perspective.
Now, if we go to page 210, you record, I think, the requirement in Airwave Policy 664, this is at paragraph 8.4.5, that handheld airwave radios, when not being used, should be either worn by the user or double locked, kept behind two locked doors, which might include a locked glove compartment in a locked car, for example. Yes?
Yes.
Now, dealing with the possibility first of wearing the devices, you picked that issue up a little earlier on at page 205 of your report at paragraph 8.1.9, and there you come back to the point about them not being intrinsically safe. Now, as to that, at 8.1.9, as to that, is that because of their transmission strength?
Yes, although as I've said before, it is possible to get higher transmission strength devices which are purposely designed to be intrinsically safe.
Right.
But that would be a requirement at purchase.
Yes, and in fact you say that in the next paragraph. There are intrinsically safe variants of Airwave devices, but it's unclear if any were held by the LFB on the night of the fire. And how would those variants differ from a normal Airwave radio, do you think?
Probably in terms of cost.
Well, okay, but how are they technically different?
Well, the reason for the additional cost would be that the fabrication and the components used would have to pass more stringent tests to be safely used in an intrinsically safe environment. And as we've discussed previously, in my opinion, it's likely that even those that were intrinsically safe would not reach the highest levels of stringency that we described this morning for the lower powered devices.
Yes, I follow. Now, earlier in your evidence, you touched on the Lackland House Coroner's Rule 43 recommendation to the LFB that it should consider using additional radio channels at major incidents. And we looked at that, and in particular, the LFB's position that the risks of doing so outweighed the benefits. That's the background to what I'm about to ask you about. If you go, please, to page 78 of your report and go to paragraph 4.13.7 on that page, you set out the draft response to the Coroner's Rule 43 recommendation proposals, and the source document that you're citing here and you're replicating within the box on that page is, I think, a draft set of proposals which could be submitted to the coroner. Now, we've got a later draft of that from April 2013, which I'd like to show you. It's at LFB 000-34062. If we look at the first page of that, there it is. There's the document that was familiar to us when we looked at this with Assistant Commissioner Gary Reason. And if we go to page 9, that's where the communications proposals start. And the passage I want to ask you about is on page 10. If we go to that, please, and look at the top row. It sets out the options considered by the LFB. And if you look at the fourth paragraph down, there's an italic. It says, use of airwave digital radios. You see that?
Yes.
And it goes on. Currently, these radios, issued to all flexible duty officers, are used primarily for communications between the incident ground and the brigade's mobilising control. Expanding the use of digital radio talk groups, for example, for the incident command team, would provide the opportunity to free up analogue radio channels. This does, however, bring another level of complexity in managing information flows at an incident. Now, in your view, does using both analogue and digital radio technology on the fire ground add a level of complexity to communications?
I don't think that one necessarily follows from the other. I think that there are ways of mitigating that complexity and integrating the use of those technologies, just as there are ways of integrating the use of Barry sets with handheld radios in the existing policy. It does, I think, add a level of complexity, but you could also argue it adds another level of improved resilience. And under circumstances where this technology might improve communication, that would be worth paying.
What do you want? Sorry.
No,
continue.
I was just going to say that, to me, a lack of communication is the greatest danger in incidents of this nature. As I said before, the lack of communication could be a communication failure, or it could be through injury and incident to the personnel affected.
Are you able to help us understand, looked at objectively, what the complexities would be, quotes, in managing information flows at an incident, and why that might be a problem?
Well, I with all the documents I've seen, I think this is a much, much bigger issue, and it's not. There are many, many, many levels to this, and so, if I probably later on you will want to talk about the CAD system used by the ambulance service and by the Metropolitan Police, but to me that's a very effective tool in managing information flow, because it stores information in a textual form that could be searched and looked up after the event. And to me, one of the recommendations that I believe is that Grenfell teaches us about the need to manage information as much about devices. I feel there's so much focus on intrinsically safe, not intrinsically safe, digital versus analog. To me, it's what happens to FSG information from the moment at which it arrives into the system to the point at which it's used. What happens in terms of the flow of information in the opposite direction from the operational crews back out to the incident commander that's making really critical risk-based decisions. And to me, from what I've seen in the witness statements, there is like a mosaic or patchwork of devices, each of which fills a kind of a niche need. And then there's an awful lot of policy around that people perhaps didn't always understand, that is intended to form the interface between those devices. So I understand this quote, and in the context of how things are managed at the moment, I perhaps agree that adding Airwave would add an unnecessary layer of complexity. But I would rather people take a step back and say, what do we require for a digital fireground that manages the seamless transfer of information and doesn't rely on many, many procedures and policies to be remembered by crew and commanders in a complex, dynamic site where things will fail and do fail. So to me, my focus is on that sentence, managing information flows at an incident, rather than on the caveat about Airwave devices.
Now, moving on with how Airwave could be used, you told us earlier, and your report says it, that talk groups are not immune from congestion, but nonetheless that could be addressed on a case-by-case basis by the creation of talk groups. Have I got that right?
Exactly.
Yes. Now let's then look in light of that at page 211 of your report, at section 8.4.8. You, I think, acknowledge the concern set out by Dominic Ellis in his witness statement, and you've set out a quotation there from his witness statement at page 18, paragraph 80. But it says in quotation at line 6 in the text, where it starts Airwave devices. Can you see? It says Airwave devices work differently in that they have a national coverage, meaning that different incidents or functions would have to be directed to use specific talk groups to ensure that there was no two incidents using the same frequency. This could cause delays at incident sites and needs new talk groups being allocated to BA or specific sector roles, etc. The Airwave network does not have an infinite capacity and was developed on the presumption that fire and rescue services do and would continue to use UHF radios for incident ground communications. It is not necessarily the case that the current Airwave network has the capacity to handle the large amount of communications generated at incidents within its area, even assuming the issues identified above could be overcome. Now, do you have any feel for, first, how long it takes to set up an Airwave talk group?
I in the report refer to the Metropolitan Police's guidance on the manipulation and creation of the talk groups, which is partly the technical time, but also deals with the policy that needs, so that individuals can't spontaneously create a talk group that would then create an information ghetto, if you like. And so I think it's a considered process, but something which other emergency services have guidance on and operational experience of.
I see. Is Dominic Ellis's point that I've read at length to you here a valid one in your opinion, Professor?
Again, I think there are a number of issues to be considered. So he's right in suggesting that the Airwave network does have finite capacity, but as mentioned elsewhere in my report, there are ways of working with the operators of the network to increase capacity in response to specific incidents. And that's a facility which is far harder to achieve with UHF point-to-point devices. And So, to me, as we'll have seen in many different areas of the evidence, prima facie arguments are used without the subtlety of exploring. Very often in the evidence I've seen, I want to ask why and what alternatives exist, rather than simply accept it at face value. So I think you'll have seen that from a technical perspective, many of these objections could have been overcome with a degree of support from the manufacturers and a willingness to question the existing level of provision. I think the phrase I use in the report is the making do culture. So people made do with systems far longer than I think they should have done in terms of the technical provision from those systems.
Mr. Chairman, I'm in the middle of a topic, and there is no immediately obvious place to ask you for a break, so I'll ask you for one now.
Yes, all right. Well, probably is a good thing to have a break now, Professor. We'll stop. We'll resume at 3:30, please.
Thank
and
you.
as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. 3:30, please. Would you ask Mr. Johnson to come back in, please? All right, Professor Johnson,
Yes,
ready
thank
to
you.
keep going?
Yes, very.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Can we please go to page 212 of your report and look at section 8.4.13? Now, you discuss here the experience of the Metropolitan Police and the LAS in exclusively using airwave radio, and you say that both organisations have successfully avoided the problems that might otherwise arise from a proliferation of talk groups across the incident ground. See that there. How, in your view, have the Metropolitan Police Service and the LAS successfully avoided those problems?
I think by creating distinctions between tactical and operational talk groups, and I think that I feel that some of the lessons could be applicable more generally to an FRS, but that there would need to be some adaptation. But I don't. To me, it's seen that from the previous quotation from the CLG report, you will have seen that this is seen as an insurmountable problem. But with the guidance and the operational experience that's been gained since that time, I don't think that objection holds in the way that it maybe did before there was that operational experience. I think that's the point that I'm trying to make there.
Thank you. Can we go back a page to page 211, please, and pick up the passage of Dominic Ellis's statement at paragraph 8.4.8? I read this all to you, but I just want to have a look at the second part of the passage of the paragraph I read to you, where it says the airwave network does not have an infinite capacity, and it continues. And he refers to the complexity of setting up talk groups for specific incidents, as we've seen. Can you tell us, what is your view about how likely it is that the airwave network could accommodate additional traffic from fire and rescue services?
The national contract for Airwave specifies coverage in a percentage of the UK, and then the amount of capacity will differ, as I understand it, depending on the location within that coverage. So if it were a relatively remote location, the amount of capacity would be more limited than if it were in an urban environment, all other things being equal. So if there were multiple incidents within an urban environment at the same time, then the capacity again might be limited in that situation.
Yeah, yes, I see. And I linked to that, I think we find something similar at page 225. If we can look at that, and specifically section 8.13.8. Now you say there, by reference to the DMO-TMO approach, and that I think is dual-use radio, and just to be clear, TMO, I think, is trunk mode operation.
Yes, if you remember from earlier that direct mode is equivalent to walkie-talkie use, yes, without a base station, and trunk mode is through the base station into the national network, as we've described.
Yes, and essentially that's dual technology, isn't it?
It's just two different architectures of using the same thing.
You say here that the flexibility would have required coordination to ensure that teams used consistent means of conveying critical information during the fire. For instance, teams might have to summarise information communicated over DMO when they returned to TMO network coverage. Does that mean that there has to be coordination to ensure that critical information about the incident is conveyed across different operational teams?
Yes. So if I communicated to you on a DMO mode, we would be potentially the two people that would hear it. And then when one of us goes back to the ability to communicate nationwide, we would have to then pass the message on that we'd conveyed in the direct mode.
Indeed.
Just as it would between the Barry sets and the wider fireground communication if they were isolated.
Now, on page 229 of your report, let's have it up, paragraph 8.16.5, page 229, you explain that a CAD system or computer-aided dispatch system could help. Could you tell us briefly how you envisage a CAD system helping in the coordination of radio types and radio channels?
Yes. As I alluded to earlier, one of the limitations that we have with voice communication is that the communication is transient. And so if you have interruption or you're disconnected and you don't hear a message, there's no effective way for you to replay that message. And instead, when you go back into coverage, you take out more finite bandwidth by saying, did I miss anything? Or repeating a message, did you hear me? Whereas the CAD system provides a text-based interface to be able to replay previous decisions or previous information or previous radio messages. And so rather than if I can't communicate with you, if you're too busy for me to pass a message to using voice communication, I could log a message on the CAD system, which you could then scroll to, or another person could scroll to later on. So if you like, it provides an archive of communication. And very importantly, if we were to decide to change channel, for instance, this decision could be logged within the CAD system and communicated even to those people who didn't hear it at the time but may have seen it at a later date.
Now,
Sorry, just to make sure we understand, how do you log a message into the CAD system? Will it take an oral message?
One of the arguments that I've made elsewhere in the report is that with speech recognition technology, it would be possible potentially to store a message even on a firefighter's personal equipment, and for them then, when they go into coverage, not to be forced to repeat that message, but for the system to automatically replay it in the same way as a voicemail message, if you could think of it, once coverage is resumed. And that message could be conveyed on an information channel that's separate from a voice channel. I didn't go into all the elaborate architectures in the report, but a more modern form of integrated information management system could take an awful lot of load away from the voice communication and use forms of messaging, and also reduce a lot of pressure on the firefighters in terms of making sure that information was conveyed. Another particular advantage of that would be that the transfer of messages could be done automatically between people. So my message could be stored on my system but then copied to you, and then if you go back into radio contact, even my messages might be forwarded from your system. So a whole group of communication could be passed on automatically without the need for additional voice overheads through the use of speech recognition and other technologies which are beyond what's involved in CAD, but they're not beyond what is technically possible even for a modest amount of processing today.
is there a difference between the Airwave's text messaging functionality and a CAD system?
The way I view Airwave's text messaging system is much more in terms of direct communication, whereas the CAD system for me is a more integrated information management system with the ability to store messages in a more structured fashion.
Now, in the event that a fire and rescue service chose not to adopt a broader use of Airwave handsets, I think you're of the view, as you set out at page 213, paragraph 8.5.3, if we just look at it, do you say, in extremis, these higher-powered radios could be deployed by the LFE to address the communications problems in high-rise buildings, but only if such a contingency has been anticipated and trained for. Could you explain how it is that you see Airwave operating as a contingency in extremis?
This is a really interesting point that I probably haven't emphasised enough in the report, but in the original work I did in 9/11, there was a really noted difference between the ability of Fire Department of New York and similarly equipped personnel to penetrate into the World Trade Center compared to something called New York Police Department Emergency Service Units. The Police Department Emergency Service Units in many cases did not have breathing apparatus but did have high-powered radios, and they got further into the World Trade Center and were able to communicate faster back to the ground stations than the firefighters were. And so in many cases the police heard the order to withdraw, whereas the firefighters didn't, because they were using lower powered devices. That's a very, very practical example where I don't think it was taken as a coherent decision. It just happened that the emergency service units were equipped in that way, but there is clear operational benefit in the case of 9/11 for more lightly equipped people penetrating farther with higher powered radios.
What would be the problem about equipping the London Fire Brigade with an equivalent of high-powered radios used by the New York Police Department?
I think the intrinsic safety issues that we've rehearsed and again the meta level issues that we've rehearsed over who would take the decision to deploy them and at what point, and I think that depends on reliable communication as to the risk that people are encountering when they go in with intrinsically safe devices.
Right. Now, can I just ask you briefly about some other digital technologies, starting with the CSS, or Command Support System, which you covered at 8.17 of your report at page 229 and following. Now, we know from evidence at phase 1 of the inquiry that the CSS didn't work as intended on the night of the fire. But could you tell us, in brief, if you can, how the CSS would be capable, in theory at least, of helping fireground communications?
I think it would have acted as a central repository for information, drawing on many different sources, as we can see from the quotations that I've given here. And I think there was an ambition for it to serve that purpose. Sorry, go on.
Would a functioning CSS provide the same or similar benefits as a CAD system?
It would have provided some of them, but I struggle to understand why this is not a joint procurement exercise as it would be, for example, in some areas of the military. This to me is the information management and information integration is a core technology, and this is a very important to me general point, which is that the very different levels of provision of service, even within the London users of Airwave, is a mystery to me. Why London Fire Brigade were unable to get access to text messaging facilities on Airwave, whereas other agencies were. And so to me, integrated procurement of emergency services and integrated information management, and I think also the ability to use open standards so that even if one supplier provides a product, it can connect to the products of other suppliers without endless communication and misunderstanding and delays. To me, this is part of the deeper cultural issues about technology management.
Now, looking at a little bit more closely at mobile telephone technology, first, how do mobile signals compare with digital airwave radio signals? Let's say, how do they compare? How do they compare in functionality terms?
Well, I think for obvious reasons, the digital telephones that we rely on today have gone through many series of upgrades and obviously offer higher levels of capacity and bandwidth, but there's less guarantee in terms of coverage, which is obviously essential for an emergency service network. But you know, this is a very difficult comparison to make, given the legacy nature of Airwave, and obviously the expectation that the emergency service network would have been deployed long before now.
Let me try and get it a bit differently.
Yeah.
To what extent, if at all, are mobile phone signals subject to the propagation issues that you and I have discussed today and in your report?
They are. I mean, they are subject to those propagation issues, but the intrinsic safety is not a significant issue in the use of mobile phones, and hence you shouldn't use them in garage forecourts and so forth. Although the wattage is again capped in the way that I've described in the report.
But they're operating on radio signals, aren't they?
Yes, in
it's in a sense it's intrinsically the same as airwave radio,
exactly,
just operating on different frequencies.
Exactly.
Now, if we go, please, to page 267 of your report and look at section 9.8, that's headed bandwidth limitations. You can see there that you give your view. Any analysis of the actual and future uses of mobile telephony in incident ground communications must consider how many devices could be in operation at any one time without adversely affecting performance. Now, are you referring there to how many calls could successfully take place in and around the fireground?
Yes. Again, we have experience of this in 7/7 and 9/11, where as I mentioned previously today, there were privilege access schemes that the emergency services could use. So in the UK's context, our system would block public use of the mobile phone network within particular areas if it were to be activated. So it's a very major step to do that.
Yes, I see.
If that was not done, then the number of calls made by the public for very understandable reasons would interfere with the ability of the fire and rescue services to complete a call. And so we see in some of the witness statements that attempts were used to make mobile phone calls by FRS personnel and they didn't complete. Within that, it's also important to understand that you can use different techniques to increase your likelihood of the information getting through. So in general, the advice is under such circumstances to use text messaging because it uses less bandwidth and is more likely to complete than a voice call for the reasons that we've described before.
Yes, that's helpful. Yes, I see. Now, can I then turn to a different topic, which is the need for holistic communication systems? And I want to ask you about the safety case. Can we start, please, at page 167 of your report, at section 6.17? And you've made a number of references in your report to safety cases, and you recommend that safety cases be adopted by fire and rescue services, as you do here. And could you just explain first to the panel what is a safety case, briefly?
A safety case is used in the Ministry of Defence and in the offshore industry and in various branches of transport, extensively in aviation. And it's a structured argument about the evidence I would use to show that my system is acceptably safe. And so, sorry.
No, that's helpful. And you wanted to finish your answer?
I was just going to say very importantly that it's usually a diagrammatic structure which breaks the argument down into different steps, but at the bottom of it are documents that provide the evidence that your system is safe. So if I say, very frequently in the evidence I see people making assertions that we conducted a risk assessment and we determined that a medium level of intrinsic safety was an appropriate policy for future acquisition in LFB. That's a statement from one of the witnesses. Now, in a safety case, I would be obliged to provide a reference to the document that indeed showed that risk assessment. So, and the key point I would make here is that in the arguments that I've presented to you and you've asked questions about, we've had to refer to hundreds of documents. And it's very difficult for us. I mean, it should be evident to everyone that this argument that we're going through has been rehearsed over close to 2 years in forming a view of all of these documents together. And this should have been done before the incident and exposed. So if something like this happened again, God forbid, or if an incident like Lacken Hall were to occur again, then what you do is you examine each piece of evidence that's referred to in the safety case and you challenge whether that's true. So if you say you did a risk assessment on the use of intrinsically safe devices and the communication failed in a previous incident because of the power issues, or you had the coroner's recommendations, you would then say, actually, my argument no longer holds because that evidence has been challenged in court. So you review your safety case in the light of subsequent experience, and that's a formal obligation within many other industries to do that.
Now, if you go to page 167 of your report, sorry, we're on page 167. If you go to section 6.17.3, you say a formal safety case should be developed by all FRS to explain in a single coherent document why their existing fireground communication equipment provides an acceptable level of safety, together with the evidence that supports this argument. You refer to a single coherent document. What level of detail would you expect a safety case in such a document to provide?
So a safety case itself could be quite high level, because really what you're wanting to do is to provide a structure that can then be challenged by inquiries like this. But the evidence that it refers to in the documents below it should be at a level of detail greater than we've seen, I think, in some cases here.
And if we look at the next paragraph, 6.17.4, you say the fireground communications safety case must then be maintained as new operational evidence becomes available or as new systems are procured. And then at 5, if communications fail during an incident, then existing evidence must be re-examined, and the overarching arguments that the system is acceptably safe must be challenged. Well, you see what you say, but How often would you expect a safety case to be reviewed?
I'm used to reviewing them depending on the criticality of the system, but certainly if an incident occurred, I would automatically do a review of the safety case where it was felt to be relevant or germane to the system. And I would, in the context of an FRS, an incident involving BA equipment anywhere in the UK should trigger a review from each FRS in a systematic way. And conventionally, it's more determined, I think, by changes in the environment or changes in policy or changes in equipment, as well as operational practice. All of those things would trigger a change rather than months. I think there's a difference where you might have to update it in terms of a digital system with security considerations, because cybersecurity threats change more frequently than the environment in which a safety case itself would change, simply because adversaries are deliberately trying to attack digital systems. So this same technique that I've been talking about here is also used to increase confidence in the security of a system, and the frequency with which you review the evidence for a security case is more frequent than in the case of safety, because you've got an adversary who's trying to attack your system.
Right, I see.
But the same rules and ideas apply here.
Yes. Now, at various points in your report, you've advocated for organisations to take a systemic view of communications frameworks to which applies to them, and we've seen some of that in the report.
Yeah.
Can we look, please, at page 26 of your report and look at section 2.10? Now, this is within 2.10. Subparagraph 21, you say, the successful uptake of such innovations requires an organisation to take a systemic view of its communications framework, focusing on the integration and resilience of multiple infrastructures. This should be supported by coherent, evidence-based arguments to demonstrate that incident ground communications systems meet acceptable levels of safety. And then at 22, you say, such a systemic view focuses less on the functionality of individual technologies and more on the way in which different systems are used together to respond to operational requirements, as demonstrated by the evidence from training, drills, and incidents. Now, based on that, and on what you've told us already this afternoon, does it follow that it's your opinion, Professor, that an organisation's communications system is just as important as its communication equipment?
Emphatically so, yes.
Emphatically. Now, if we go to page 29, you say in section 2.12 at the top of the page, by reference to LFB 488, which says this: effective communications are the key to success. A reliable communications network is essential for safe operation at incidents and fundamental for securing the level of command required to manage operational resources effectively. You say at 2.13, the systems available on the night of the fire did not meet an acceptable level of reliability. So can we take it that your opinion is that the LFB policy, as quoted here in 488, was an aspiration only, not reflecting the realities?
Yes.
And could you explain why you've reached that view?
Apart
from by reference to everything you've told us so far.
I think my ultimate feeling is this, that irrespective of whether individually, leaving aside the question of whether the systems did or did not function correctly on the night, there are so many questions about what should have happened and would have happened when those devices failed that I don't believe that there was adequate thought about the integration and recovery of communication during the incident. So very simply, if you were to decide to switch channel or deploy leaky feeders, how is that communication handled, and how do you ensure the safety of personnel? And another aspect of that would be when the bridgeheads were moved, for example, and the communication of that, the consequences of that.
Yes.
So I agree with your earlier statement in that respect.
You. Now, going back to page 22 of your report, if we can look together at paragraph 10 there, you say this, page 22, paragraph 10, subparagraph 10, I've been unable to find any evidence of sustained planning to recover from the widespread loss of BA communications in a complex fireground, for example, during the relocation of BA entry control stroke of the Bridgehead. Now, when you use the phrase sustained planning, what do you mean?
I would have liked to have either within the training that you've shown, the computer-based training or other forms of training, a series of exercises and drills that prepared people for recovering communication during an incident of this nature, so that there was less of a feeling that people were battling against communication failures on the night without resorting to which is, as you've argued or as if you've pointed to in the previous discussion, things like the use of the personal radios without a risk assessment being communicated, and these seem to have been ad hoc decisions that were not, I think, either sufficiently rehearsed or planned for in terms of the training, in order to feel confident that that was anything other than a response of individual firefighters to an increasing lack of communication.
Would your phrase sustained planning not only include training, which would of course be brigade-wide and not building-specific, but also planning for specific fires in specific buildings pursuant to the information gathering obligation under 7.2D?
I strongly agree with that.
Now, if we go to page 196 of your report at section 7.12.12, your conclusion, I think, is this right? That the LFB's training left firefighters unprepared to address the communications problems they encountered in the Grenfell Tower fire. Does it follow from that and what we've just said that it's training both in relation to how to recover generally from a communications failure on any fire ground, but also how to collect building-specific information under 7.2D?
I would find it difficult to enumerate the many levels at which that statement applies. Right. I think it also applies to the decision-making, for instance, to deploy leaky feeders and repeaters, to then absolutely validate that the decision is what has actually been implemented on the fire ground, and also to ensure that adequate consideration was taken for communication in comparison to all the other operational demands that were pointed out by Commissioner Dobson as reasons why the decision might have been delayed to do that. So I think there is a level of complexity in the experience that we've seen of fighting high-rise fires that I don't think people were prepared for when I read the witness statements to this inquiry. I don't think the training was adequate in the view of the firefighters as their evidence is collected.
Now, building on that, if I may, can I just pick up your references in a number of places to what you, I think, have identified as a need for cultural change within the London Fire Brigade when it comes to incident communications? And I just want to work out what it is you mean by that, by reference to some of the specific points you make in your report. Can we start, please, at page 33, where you say this at sections 2.19.1 and 2. And the heading is, communications failures stem from cultural issues. And you say the decisions that helped undermine situation awareness at Grenfell Tower were taken in the months and years before the fire. In particular, these decisions exacerbated delays in replacing aging analogue and digital communications infrastructures. The delays can be explained by a culture of making do and failing to tackle the limitations of existing radio systems in concrete high-rise structures. Now, there are two issues, it seems, there. First, delay, explained by a culture of making do, as you put it, and secondly, failing to tackle the limitations of existing radio communication systems in concrete high-rise structures. I want to break those down if I can. Starting with the first, delays, can we go to section 2.19.3, which is the next paragraph down, where you say this: there was arguably a sense of complacency because the ageing communications infrastructures had not been exposed to a disaster on the scale of events that unfolded at Grenfell Tower, even though other events in the UK and abroad had illustrated the need for more systemic approaches to incident ground communications. Now, you say they were ageing communications infrastructures. Why do you describe them as ageing?
All of the infrastructures that we've described so far were the subject of replacement programs that had been delayed at the point of the fire, as I understand it. Many of them are still not being completed today, in the case of Airwave, for instance, and to a certain extent the Barry sets. But I also go back to evidence presented to this inquiry on numerous occasions where very senior members of the London Fire Brigade make that very point, especially in relation to, for instance, the problems of roving the wired Barry sets. There was some very disparaging remarks made about how obsolete this technology was by the top-level leadership on that point.
When you say roving, you mean coming loose in the headset?
Yeah, exactly. Looping them through the tunic and then making sure that they were in contact with the headset. And again, to say that that's a obsolete technology in the leadership group, and then to see that this was a frequent complaint of firefighters on the scene of the fire, to me illustrates that making do was seen to be not necessarily acceptable, but I don't think it had sufficient challenge. As a technologist, I wouldn't have accepted that myself.
Can we go to page 51 of your report, and let's look at section 3.6.2. You talk about delays under the paragraph there, and you say in the previous paragraph that the personal radios and Barry sets were introduced in 2005 and 2006. And in this paragraph, 3.6.2, you say, following the Grenfell Tower fire, the LFB have acknowledged that, quotes, the anticipated life expectancy of the radios was 10 to 12 years, while the Barry was expected to need replacement after 8 to 10 years. And that's a quotation from an update called Replacement of Incident Ground Communications. Now, given the age of this equipment and its date of initial introduction, that, I think, am I right, would result in an anticipated replacement date of between 2015 and 2017 for the handheld UHF radios and 2013 to 15 for the Barrys.
Yeah,
yes.
That's my understanding.
Would you expect an organisation to replace communications equipment at the end of its life expectancy, irrespective of its performance, or would they wait until that equipment had reached the end of its usable life?
There's no simple answer to that, but I think the question should be based on the risks posed by continuing to use those pieces of equipment in the light of operational experience, such as the previous incidents that we've described involving high-rise buildings. I also have seen arguments used and again it's cited in my report, where people say that a device continues to be adequate because it's still sold in the marketplace, which to me is not a convincing argument.
Can you explain why not?
Well, I could probably go out and find a VHS video recorder being sold, but that doesn't mean that it's an adequate means of digital communication in today's society. I mean, I think there's an opportunity cost in not upgrading technology, which can be measured, at least in terms of the additional risk, that could have been mitigated by the use of more flexible or modern forms of communication. Certainly, I think the roving headsets is an example of that. And at the very least, I would have, and in answer to an earlier question you were suggesting about the use of more detailed evidence, I would have liked to have seen more detailed and coherent evidence to explain why the status quo was acceptable given the range of potentially more flexible alternatives that were being discounted.
Now, if we look at paragraph 3.6.6 on page 52, the next page, you excerpt from the 2014 to 15 departmental plan of LFB's Operational Resilience and Training Department, ORT, as follows, and there's a quotation. 7th January 2015, quarter 3, 2014 to 15, during the information gathering stage for this activity, it became apparent that the current Barry sets are still available and supported, and that they continue to operate effectively. Based on this information, action has been taken to defer the replacement of Barry and IS radios until 2018. The relevant CMB, Corporate Management Board, report has been written on behalf of the lead department, IT. It is anticipated that this will be accepted by CMB. At that point, this activity will be shown as complete. Now, others may recall that this document from which you are quoting was shown to Assistant Commissioner Gary Reason. Now, as I understand it, your opinion is that the conclusion that's set out there was unsustainable. Is that correct?
I think this and many similar conclusions throughout my report, which were used to justify the delay of procurement, should have been supported by a more detailed technical analysis laying out the potential risks of following that policy.
Yes, and can I put this to you, that it was also an unsustainable conclusion because of, first, communication problems experienced at previous incidents, not least Lacknell House.
I 100% agree with you on that point.
And usability issues such as barrier headsets roving, as you put it, becoming loose and dislodged.
I agree again with that point too.
And also the conclusions of the CFOA and Local Government Association peer review of the LFB in April 2015, which you refer to in your footnote on page 51 at section 3.6.3.
The only caveat I would raise is that I think that the arguments that you're making are really good examples of a more general problem, and this is not the only instance in which arguments are made against a more coherent replacement policy of different pieces of equipment. So yes, I agree with all that you've said.
Right. Can you identify anything that the LFB was not aware of in relation to the ageing nature of its comms equipment in 2015?
Nothing.
Thank you. Now,
can I raise a small caveat to that, though? Again, really, which is very important to me personally, which is that many of the incidents that I've cited from in my report, the reports were extremely difficult to find. And so although I agree with you that most of this information, or all of the information that we've reviewed, was available to them, was it available to every person that was in a significant decision-making role within the organisation? I can't answer that. Is there any central resource where somebody with an interest in asking significant questions about technical infrastructure supporting UK FRS? Again, I think that that's a significant omission that undermines the future safety of firefighters and residents. Sorry about that. I just wanted to make that really clear.
Yes, thank you very much for that clarification. I'd like then to move from the issue of delay and onto what you've described as the failure to tackle the limitations of existing radio systems in concrete high-rise structures, which we saw in the report earlier. If we go back to page 31, please. You can see at section 216, that's your conclusion. Communications concerns were known. And then if you look at 216.4.4, you say there, senior officers argued that they could not reasonably have foreseen an incident on the scale of Grenfell Tower, and then at 2.16.5. However, many of the incident ground communications problems that were experienced during the fire were well known, particularly in the aftermath of the Lacknell House fire, but also from other previous fires in the UK and from terrorist attacks, all summarised in section 4 of my report. And then at subparagraph 6, you say, significant opportunities to learn lessons from previous incidents were not taken, and you give examples. Now, if you go to paragraph 24 on page 26, within section 2.10, you say, considerable cultural change is required if the LFB is to fully exploit the opportunities offered by these technologies in the future digital incident ground. In summary, what do you mean by cultural change?
I think that there are fantastic opportunities. Although my evidence today might have seemed slightly negative and critical, I think this is a real turning point, and there is an opportunity to do things better here. The cultural change I've talked about in many sections of my report. So the first point I would make is to reiterate something that we've just said, which is that there is ample evidence of communication problems on the fire ground with breathing apparatus equipment from many of the incidents that appear in my report. I've not seen any other easily accessible source that brings all that evidence together. The second point I would make is that the existing experience in the UK of our ability to handle the technologies to support emergency services is not good. and it's characterised by delay and a lack of budgetary control. And I think part of that is a rejection of things like open standards, which could allow more suppliers to provide products and services that are more agile in meeting the needs of fire and rescue services into the future. And that cuts across one-to-one relationships with very large suppliers. And I think that that's important when you look at later in my report, when I discuss, for instance, the communication with the supplier of the text facility within Airwave. And that, to me, is a really eloquent example of the problems that I think exist at present.
And finally, I think, if we go to page 36 in your report, to section 2.22, Professor, you have a heading, Cultural Change from Making Do to Technical Excellence. And you say this in section 2.22.7. A precondition for change is the acceptance that the LFB should move away from a culture of focusing on device specifications towards resilient and systemic approaches where policy, training and procurement are continually examined in the light of operational experiences, not just from within their own organisation, but also from other FRS and from other industries. Would it be fair to say that this cultural change which you have identified as needed is inherently connected to your suggestion of a safety case?
Yes.
It is.
Yes.
Professor, I've come to the end of my prepared questions for you. There may be one or two others I need to come back to, and others that others may wish me to ask. But I'm going to ask the Chairman now for a short break, if I may.
Yes.
So that we can look at those.
Well, Professor Johnston, when we get to this stage in the proceedings, we always have a break partly to enable counsel to check that he's not left anything out that he should have covered, and partly to enable others who are not here but are following the proceedings to suggest questions that perhaps we should put to you. So we're going to break now. We'll come back at 4:30, Mr. Millett.
I think that would be all right if
If you need longer,
not,
you
I'll
can
ask.
just send the usher.
May I? Thank you.
I think we'll get back if we can at 4:30, and we'll then see if there are any further questions for you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to go to the usher, please? Right, Mr. Millett, well, we'll say 4:30, but if it turns out that more time is required, you can just let us know.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, would you ask Professor Johnson to come back in, please? Yeah. All right, Professor Johnson. Well, we'll see if there are any more questions for you. Yes? Yes, Mr. Miller?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, there are no further questions for you, Professor Johnson.
Thank you.
So it only remains for me to express our gratitude to you for coming to the inquiry and giving us the very great benefit of your opinions and your oral evidence today, as well as your report. So thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you for everything that you're doing.
Well, Professor Johnson, I really think I should thank you on behalf of all three members of the panel. We found it very interesting to read your report and to hear your evidence today, which has been really illuminating. So thank you very much indeed. A lot of work gone into your report, we can see that. And it's good of you to give us a day as your time to be here to give us your evidence. So we're very grateful.
Oh, I'm very grateful.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and now you're free to go.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, now, Mr. Millett, that is a convenient point for today, I imagine.
It is. Thank you very much.
And we have another witness tomorrow.
We have an expert witness tomorrow. It's Steve McGurk.
Thank you very much. Well, then we'll end the day at that point, and we'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.